This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Kia ora, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. I'm super excited to be sat and to be talking about friendship and allyship today. And I think in my head I've always thought of these two in a similar vein to each other, and there is crossover between friendship and allyship, but they are really different, and I don't think we talk about the difference between the two enough, and how nuanced they are from each other. And I think I've had like moments that I'm about to describe before, but I have been binge watching the latest season of Sex Education, and it's such a fantastic show. I'm so sad that this is going to be the final one ever, but anyways, that is a side tangent. I could go on for ages how much I love Sex Education. But there's a really key moment, and don't worry, there will not be any spoilers for those who also watch Sex Education too and just haven't had a chance to yet. But there is a major point or major evolution in Otis and Eric's friendship. And it wasn't until there was a specific moment in one of the episodes where it just sparked this thought in my head where I think we need to stop talking about friendship as if it's the same as allyship. And so I kind of wanted to spend this episode talking about, what those two are, how they differ from each other, and how as a friend you can be a better ally. Because I get this question a lot, like how do I work on my empathy? How do I show up for my friends better? And I hope by distinguishing friendship and allyship, and this episode will kind of give some golden nuggets as to how they're different and maybe what we can all be working on. Because I'm very much including myself in this. There's a lot of things that I personally need to work on, but some insights that can help us figure out or clarify what we want to work on next. So I suppose a good starting point would be then talking about, well, what is the difference between allyship and friendship? Because I think they're often spoken about as if they're in a similar vein, and I think they do share some key things like, supporting someone, listening to someone, standing up for someone and walking with them. But they're coming from really different energies or, spaces. They're coming from different starting points, but I think they do come together and share a lot of key things, and those key things are really instrumental to what makes up a friendship and what is allyship. But in my mind, allyship is coming from, allies are those who come from positions of privilege, and they have that power, and so they're using their power and using their privilege to then offer that as to stand in solidarity with a community or someone that doesn't have that privilege. And I just want to make it clear here that because we can have a different set of privileges or lack of privileges depending on the context, it acknowledges that. But so just because you're an ally in one sense, it doesn't mean that that applies to all context or all identities in your life. It is complex and layered, but essentially, allies are those who do have that privilege and that power in whatever circumstance it may be, and offering their support, and using their privilege and power to help uplift others. And the way that allies do that is also very different depending on the context, and the way that someone does tap into their privilege to uplift others. That can be done in so many ways. And I feel like there's no specific way to do that, because it very much depends on who's being involved, what the situation is, what's the best way to uplift in that particular circumstance. I don't think there is a one size fits all for how one can practice their allyship. But it's that key thing of you tapping into privilege and power to uplift others. And when you think about friendships, well, that's really different to that. Some people argue that allyship is quite a transactional relationship. My 2 cents on that is that it is, because if you are tapping into your privilege and power to uplift others, it's not like it's exactly the same as a friendship where it's a two-way street and both people are investing in each other to keep the relationship growing. So I suppose in that sense, allyship, yes, is transactional, because it's about, there's, in this dynamic, there is only one person who is giving their privileged power to uplift the other. Allyship is more transactional in that sense, but a friendship is very much reliant on both people putting in to the relationship to maintain it and keep it growing. And now that we've kind of talking about the differences between the two, you can see that, they do share those key elements, because not only in both you need to be in tune with each other and really deeply listening to each other, and you need to be able to support each other. So those key things are still really relevant and important to both allyship and friendship. But I think, and the thing that we really don't think about the most, and I think this is what's so different between allyship and friendship, is that allies are the ones who do have the power, and they are saying, look, I recognize my power and my privilege, and I am going to tap into that. I'm going to use that to uplift others. And that in itself is helping to, dismantle the system and to bridge that gap. So allies are those who have that power and that privilege. And I can already kind of anticipate the questions around, well, what about if we're moving away from dynamics that are away from, the majority, which tends to be, which most of the time is Pākehā people. How do we move, moving away from that, how else can other communities be an ally? And I think what I'm specifically meaning here is that, and I think I can see this a lot in my personal world because of the intersectionalities of, being Black, but then also being a woman, but then also being a Muslim. And my personal space, I can see how can we support our different communities. Like, for example, how do I was just reading a paper earlier last week talking about how to promote allyship and friendship in the mosque. And so this was a research paper done in America, and it was a specific, the local mosque, I forgot what city it was in, but they were looking at how to promote allyship and friendship amongst the different Muslim communities, because Islam is a very, very diverse religion. And you have people from all walks of life who call themselves a Muslim and go to the mosque. And so this paper was looking at how do we make all Muslims feel included in, whatever is happening at the mosque. And the word allyship was used a lot in there. And also I was recognizing in that specific context, who does have the power, who does have the privilege, who counts as the majority in this space. And so those questions are relevant anywhere, and it goes beyond just talking about race. Because I think we talk about allyship so much in allyship in the context of race. I think sometimes it's hard for people to see how one can be an ally or talking about allyship if it's outside of that, that race dynamic. And so, essentially what I'm trying to say is that being an ally is not just for white people. Those questions of who has the power, who has the privilege, who is the majority in this situation / context is relevant. And so, allyship is more focused on that. And friendship, is that two-way street. I feel like I don't need to get into friendship so much, because that is something that I think we all inherently understand with, if you think about the loved ones in your lives. But, if you think about your friendship circle and who you have in your life, just think about, how similar / different you are to each other, and thinking about what are the threads that keep you together. Because I think those threads are really special, and what really makes friendship different to allyship. What are those threads that keep those people in your life? The friends that you currently have, what are those threads that make you love them and adore them and want for you to stay invested in this relationship? And I think those threads is something that is different to allyship. And that kind of leads me to the next thing that I want to talk about, is that allyship and friendship are different in the sense that not every ally is a friend, and not every friend is necessarily an ally. And I think that distinction really became quite clear in that moment between Otis and Eric. And I won't get into further specific details about that, because I don't want to be that person who spoils the show for someone. But it just became very apparent, that idea of, not every ally is a friend, and not every friend is necessarily an ally. And I think another thing that I want to add there is that it's not automatic. Not every ally is automatically a friend, and not every friend is automatically an ally, because they are two different things. I think there needs to be purposeful energy put into, the identity of a friendship, or the experience of friendship and the experience of allyship. There needs to be purposeful and intentful action and belief behind those two things, because they are so different. It's not just an automatic thing that you could be friends with someone for years, decades even. And after all that history and that experience and the time with each other and all the memories, that doesn't necessarily mean that that person is automatically an ally. And there needs to be a lot of energy specifically funneled into being, into being a friend and into being an ally. And I suppose I want to kind of spend the next portion of the episode talking about, well, if you are already in that friendship zone, how does one channel that into being an ally? I think the first place that I want to start off with here is that idea that not everyone can hold every part of your being. And what I want to say around here is talking about, the role that empathy and belonging play, and the expectations that we have around friendships, especially the expectations that we have around really close friends. And I think we have this expectation that, well, not just close friends, but with friendship in general, that it's this all-encompassing relationship where, that person or, that friend will be your go-to person for everything in life. And I think that is a really unrealistic expectation. We're just so complex, and there are so many different parts and things that make up who we are as a person. To have all of that captured by one person, I think, is really a huge expectation, and something that I think is really unfair, because inevitably to have an expectation of someone like that, expectation that's so high, it will just inevitably lead to hurt, whether that hurt is disappointment or it will just lead to hurt. I think having that level of expectation of someone, and I think that expectation is really perpetuated by the media that's around us. There's so many iconic friendships that I can think of off the top of my head that really perpetuate this idea. If we think to Grey's Anatomy, and there's Christina and Meredith, and that's my person. And I'm not saying that is that's impossible, and no one should ever aspire for relationships where you're that close with someone. But all I'm saying is that to have all of your needs and all of yourself captured by one relationship or by your friends is so intense. That is so intense. And I'm not denying that there are some people in your life where these friends are so close and are so special that they are just family at that point. I'm not saying that that's not allowed or that can't happen, because it does. But I think what I'm really trying to highlight here, that not everything about who you are can be captured by a particular friend. And then there's this thing that comes to my mind, which is, and I think that's a beautiful thing about friendship, is that you can be so wildly different to each other, and still have the beautiful thing that is friendship shared between the two of you, and have this amazing relationship, and have, positive influences on each other's lives. I think that is amazing and wonderful. And that's such a blessing to experience that. But even if you are so wildly different from each other, I think there are some things and there are some places and situations where only the highest level of empathy can take you to a certain point. And that's why I'm trying to say that kind of links up with what I was saying before about not having a person, one person just can't meet all of your needs. And there will be some things where there will be some situations and contexts where, there are certain relationships or friendships where, if we think about it as a metaphor, that person kind of has the key to that particular part of your heart or your belonging or sense of self. And if we really run with that metaphor, can you imagine how heavy that key chain would be if someone was carrying literally all of the keys to who you are ever? And keep in mind, that keychain is not like a forever set because we are constantly growing and evolving as people. So it's like current keys, but also leave room for future keys. Like that is a lot for someone to carry. And I think what I'm really trying to say here is that having high empathy for someone and really wanting to know who they are doesn't necessarily equate to this sense of belonging. And it's not like I'm not saying that you won't ever understand or like that will never happen, but I think it kind of links up with that idea that if not one person is meant to carry all the keys to who you are, all of the empathy and understanding in the world doesn't necessarily mean that you will have that key. And if that key is like that sense of belonging, someone else is carrying that. And so allowing room and space for that, I think is really important. And I really don't want to get into the specifics, but you can really see how that plays out in Otis and Eric's relationship. And I think there would be a more healthy dynamic if there was more room allowed and more space allowed for the fact that you're not going to carry all of each other's keys all the time. And actually some other people will, and to leave room and space for that. And I think that's really, really important, especially when you think about being a friend and an ally. It's really important to leave space for that. I think especially if there are some parts of your friend's identity that is not celebrated in our society and doesn't have the same power and privilege. Of course you can be a friend and an ally in that situation, but being part of a friend and in that situation and an ally actually is just kind of giving that space for, those friends in your friend's life that hold those keys, to give them the space and time to enjoy that, and knowing that the best thing that you can do in that situation is allowing that space, and that in itself is part of allyship, and kind of recognizing that you won't hold the keys, all of the keys, is a really important part of allyship, because I think you're then put in a position where you're realizing that of course, in this safe space of your friendship, that person will always belong, but there will be some things that you can still be supportive and show up for them. But there will be some places where that really acute sense of belonging for that acute part of their identity is lies of someone else. So yes, before I start going on and off on a random tangent, not everyone can hold part of your being, and that's okay. And it's really important that we allow room for that. And this next part is kind of a follow-up to an extension to what I was saying before. So if before that first lesson is not everyone can hold part of your being, the second lesson here is, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is the wanting to understand and recognize. So what I was saying before was around this idea that, not everyone can attend to or hold every part of your being. And that's okay. And giving the space for that and acknowledging that, there are other relationships and other people out there who will fill that need, will be able to hold that key. But to be a better friend and also to be a better ally is recognizing that that's actually not the most important part. What the most important part of, most important part of being a better friend and ally is the wanting to understand, and the wanting to listen, and the wanting to walk alongside regardless of, where your paths are, whether they come together or not. That's not the key thing. Is walking alongside is the key part here. And again, you kind of see this playing out in Otis and Eric's friendship. And I think, that one of them, they really understand the second lesson here towards the end. But it's this concept of, well, if I know that, I can't be the person that holds all the key for my friend, but I am showing my support as a friend, and I'm showing my support as an ally is by listening and showing up. And I think from a friendship level, you want to listen and show up for your friend. And from an ally point of view, listening and understanding is so important. I think especially if we want to avoid that common trap, which is assuming what people need, or also that other common trap that happens a lot is assuming that there is, people wanting to be not saved necessarily, but people like signaling that you are ready to help and step in at any given point. And this is going to be a little bit of a side tangent, but I was talking about this with my friend the other day, where most of the time, like, we're not really thinking about racism 24/7. Like, we're at work doing our thing. We're at a restaurant thinking about what food to order. We're then at home with our family and we go out to hang out with our friends. We're just living life, minding our own business. So we're not actually really thinking about racism all the time. But there are allies who come into this situation or come into our lives, or just have interactions, and you can tell that that's what they're thinking about all the time. And it's like, you know what, just think about practicing your allyship, or coming into situations when it's needed. And we were talking about, I don't know even how we got onto this metaphor, but we were talking about how if you're drowning, you want the lifeguard to come out then and to rescue. You want the person who is the bystander to, you know, come into the situation and help you then. But if you're not drowning and you're just chilling at the beach, just living your life, you don't want for someone to then come up to you at that point and, you know, save you when there's nothing really to be saved from. But anyways, sorry, that was a bit of a side tangent. But this key of wanting to understand and listen are really, really important to what it means to be a friend and what it means to be an ally. And I know it kind of contradicts what I was saying before about, you know, even having the utmost empathy in the world doesn't necessarily replace belonging. And I still stand by that statement. I think if there are some things that if you have to learn about to understand, then that's just not the same. Like if I think about it in my personal life, you know, for my fellow Black brothers and sisters who experience that, you know, that specific anti-Blackness, racism, there's a sense of belonging to each other because there's this acute understanding that comes from both of us experiencing it, as opposed to, you know, as opposed to someone having to learn about it. And I still stand by that statement that, you know, even the highest level of empathy doesn't necessarily equate to belonging. But I think wanting to understand and wanting to cultivate that empathy is so important. You know, from a friendship level, it shows that you care. And even if you don't, haven't gone through what they've gone through, that you're here to still support them in the way that they best need. And from an ally point of view, it's really important because you're listening to, you're prioritizing someone else and listening to then understand how you can use your power/privilege to help out in that specific situation. And so that wanting to understand is so important. And that being curious and being empathetic, that's where this really, really comes in. Wanting to understand each other. And so when you are listening as a friend, also keep in mind that you're listening to be a better ally, so you know how to better support. It's being in that situation it's just, essentially the whole point of listening and leaning into that understanding is so then you know how to better support and show that in that specific situation. The next lesson that I want to talk about is the fact that people make mistakes in any relationship, in every relationship, whether it's with family, whether it's with friends, whether it's in a romantic situation. People make mistakes, and that is inevitable. I feel like I just said that word really strange, inevitable. People make mistakes. It happens. And what's more important is how to deal with that, and how to work on repairing and understanding and healing, so you then can healthily move on. But people will make mistakes. Sometimes they will be on a smaller scale, and sometimes they will be epic, epic F-ups. And that is just, I think, a guaranteed life fact. And I think Amal, maybe 10 years ago, would have not accepted that. I think I would have been like, well, if someone hurts me, then, that's the end of the relationship, or the relationship's just not the same anymore. And in my head, that was like an automatic thing. Mistake, relationship's not going to be the same, if not the end of the relationship. And it's not about how much someone loves you, or how much, if we're talking about it from an ally point of view, how dedicated they are to the cause. Like, despite the amount of love or amount of dedication, people make mistakes. And I think what's really important here is how to navigate that hurt, to move on from that. And I think a lot of problems that happen in the allyship space, but also amongst friendships as well, is not necessarily the initial hurt or harm that was done, but rather how to navigate the repair phase. And I think the key thing here, whether you are looking at it from the lens of a friendship or looking at it from the lens of allyship, is how open are you to having that uncomfortable conversation? What armors do you often bring into uncomfortable conversations? And if I'm being a little bit vulnerable and honest on here, I think for me personally, and I feel like I can be open about this now because I've done so much work in therapy. Don't worry, I still have a lot of work to do. I'm not all healed or fixed now. It's definitely a work in progress. But I think the armors that I would bring into these uncomfortable conversations is, one being, I don't want to acknowledge that maybe I am the problem or the toxic one in this situation, because in my mind, acknowledging that is confronting the truth that I am this horrible person. And so to kind of protect myself from that negative feeling, I would use the armor to not allow my headspace to get to that kind of thinking, because I just wasn't able to regulate myself. And so I would either kind of swing between these two extremes of like, yes, I did that and I'm a horrible person, so therefore like I'm the worst person on this earth and I never deserve any of these things, or the other end of the extreme to counteract from that first extreme is kind of minimizing or defending away what I've done, that's protecting my ego. And then the other extreme is just falling into this very unhelpful descent, into the point where it's like, you need to have a little bit more love for yourself and respect for yourself. And so, my armors coming into these uncomfortable conversations would be there to protect me from swinging on the pendulum between those two extremely unhelpful and unhealthy extremes. And it wasn't until I was comfortable with confronting that I've been able to still, again, a work in progress and not quite there yet, but I've been able to regulate myself to the point where I can have these uncomfortable conversations. And it doesn't mean that it's easy, uncomfortable still means that it still manifests physically, in my stomach, with my mouth being dry, with my brain just becoming so unbelievably fuzzy that it's hard to come across as articulate. It doesn't mean that those feelings go away, but in that moment, I'm able to regulate myself and to push through to have that conversation for the sake of myself and for that other person involved, but also if I've got my ally lens on, for the sake of the kaupapa. And this is my personal belief why I think everyone should just go to therapy. But I don't think you can be as open with others until you are open with yourself. And if you're not really open with yourself, those conversations can be really unproductive. And I think the armor tends to come up more in friendships, like in personal relationships like that, because you do know each other like that, and it's not like it's in the context of work, or in the context of relationships that don't go as deep. I think the beautiful thing about friendship is that especially the deeper they get, you have the space to kind of express all sides of yourself, and it's not just the good. You can bring all sides of yourself to the conversation. But so it's a lot easier, I think, for these armors to present themselves. And, going back to the reason why I had this episode, why I want to talk about this on the episode, on the show today. If you go back to Otis and Eric's friendship, when they do have those difficult conversations, you can see those armors coming up, and you can see those insecurities coming up, and they are allowed to come up because they have a relationship like that. And I think that's what friendship affords you. But that kind of links up to what I was saying before, that just because you are friends, it doesn't automatically mean that you are allies. And I think when mistakes are made, and when you are coming in from the lens of an ally, the ability to have those uncomfortable conversations are really important, and they can only healthily progress when one has the awareness to be open with themselves and be like, what is going on for me in this situation? How are my armors coming up? What are they saying? What do they look like? And I think it's not until you have that awareness are you able to have those uncomfortable conversations. And those uncomfortable conversations are really important to the repair phase. But just one needs to be open to having those conversations to begin with. The ability to look within is really important to have these uncomfortable conversations. And I think with a healthy repair, anything like moving on and progressing from that is possible, very much possible, as long as there's space for a healthy repair to even occur in the first place. The next lesson that I wanted to talk about is, and kind of flowing on from the previous idea about, people making mistakes, and it's that openness to have that uncomfortable conversation, to have a repair. Then a key part of that is communication, and having that level of communication. And I think this is where the beauty of friendship really steps in here, because I think the currency that friendship gives, it helps with that communication. Or just not necessarily the power of friendship, but just like the power of any kind of intimate personal relationship. I think when we talk about allyship a lot, it's not necessarily or often discussed in the context of personal intimate relationships that already exist, because I think the way that you would talk about allyship in relation to your personal relationships are really different to how you would talk about just allyship in general. I think, because when we do talk about allyship, just to give an example of how different they are, with allyship, we often talk about, standing up and standing up and advocating for people. And I agree that is really, really important. And, a big part of allyship is like pushing for those kind of conversations, because, it's on a day-to-day basis. Like, how often do we purposefully talk about, any of the isms? Not really. But I think when we're talking about that in the context of our personal intimate relationships, there needs to be time and space given to understand that person and to take them for where they're at right now, and thinking about the long-term plan and sowing those little seeds. But we don't talk about that a lot. I think when we're talking about allyship in general, we don't talk about that enough. The way that you would handle that conversation with your partner or family or friends is really different to just how you would have these conversations outside of those relationships. And I think allyship with those intimate relationships, it requires and asks for a different level of communication. And, this is something that I can get into specifically in another episode, because it is also very nuanced. And there are things like your feelings being validated that are really important, and safety and those kind of conversations are really important. So it's really different, but essentially the kind of conversations that you would have are really different in those intimate relationships. But I think the beauty about those intimate relationships is that you have such a strong foundation already that navigating those conversations, and maybe, there's more money in the bank, I think, and more investment essentially to have those conversations with care and consideration, and respect for each other. And there's more currency in the bank or there's more money in the bank for acceptance as well, and taking those small steps. And I just want to also make a note that just because they're intimate personal relationships, there doesn't necessarily mean that there's always a strong foundation. Like now that I'm speaking about this out loud, I'm just thinking of people who, relationships where you would expect to have a strong emotional foundation, like perhaps with siblings or parents, for example, that's not necessarily there. And that's also a very different thing. But I think that is the power of intimate relationships where that strong foundation does exist. That currency of friendship can really help with communication. Because, as I said before, those conversations are really uncomfortable and hard and not easy. But how one navigates those conversations with openness, not only does it rely on the individual's emotional intelligence and awareness, but it also depends on that dedication and commitment to each other to have that conversation, because even in that conversation, the way that things are worded perhaps may be a bit clumsy or not intended that way, but I think that dedication to have that conversation ensures that, or at least increases the likelihood that you're really listening to each other and making each other feel heard and seen is important. And the last lesson that I want to end on for this episode is that lesson that trust is earned, not signaled, even in friendships. And so not to take that trust for granted, and to really work hard in showing up for your friend. And I think especially in friendships where there is, big differences in privileges and power. And I think you can say that for most friendships, because as I said before, like who we are as a person is so layered and complex and nuanced that there will be some situations we will have privilege, and there will be some situations where we won't. And, when there is that strong foundation of friendship, you would hope that that trust is also there. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that trust is extends to situations where your friend really needs an ally. And this is what I was saying before, where, just because you're friends, it doesn't automatically, just because you're a friend, it doesn't automatically mean that you're also an ally in that situation. And so thinking about situations where even if, you do have that strong foundation of friendship and that trust is there, that trust is still earned and still needs to be earned, especially in situations where your friend is really calling on an ally. That in those situations, it's really important that that trust is not just signaled, but that trust is earned. And that means showing up as an ally when your friend really needs an ally in that situation. So to recap this episode, an ally is someone who is in a position of power / privilege, and using that to uplift others, and recognizing that not everyone can hold every part of your being, but that's not the important thing. It's the wanting to understand and walk alongside each other in your various life paths. That's the most important thing. People make mistakes in relationships, but it's that openness to have the uncomfortable conversation that's really important to the repair phase. And the currency, I think, of friendship can really help with that with that communication. And lastly, trust is earned, not signaled, even in friendships. And thank you for tuning in to this episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. I know I've been speaking so much about Eric and Otis, and if you've never watched Sex Education before, you 10 out of 10 should. It's a fantastic show. Thank you for tuning in, and catch you for the next one.
Thank you for tuning in into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. To keep spinning the yarns, let us know your thoughts. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Headscarves and Good Yarns, or email us at headscarvesandgoodyarn@gmail.com.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.